This e-learning module has been produced by the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport with funding from the European Union. This presentation was prepared for the 2018 Pacific Islands Transport Forum AMP Expo hosted by the University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji. Dr. Tristan Smith presents a 15-minute summary of the roadmap the IMO is committed to preparing by 2023. The initial strategy agreed by members in 2018 set a level of ambition of at least 50% reduction in international shipping emissions by 2050. This has significant impacts for Pacific IMO members seeking to maintain a no more than 1.5 degree course while ensuring the Pacific is not disproportionately impacted.
From global to the village, what does the IMO roadmap mean for the Paris Agreement and what are the impacts on the Pacific? My name is Dr. Tristan Smith. I'm a reader and a researcher at University College London and a director at UMass, University Marine Advisory Services. The IMO's initial strategy was adopted in April 2018, earlier this year, and embodied a number of objectives which we can use to guide whether or not the IMO is currently contributing to a 1.5 degree pathway and what scope there is for it to do so. The graph that you can see on this slide has time on the x-axis against CO2 emissions on the y-axis. The dotted line is the emissions trajectory that most expected shipping emissions to follow following an implementation of no further policy. But in April this year, there was an agreement to adopt some objectives that enshrined both an intensity reduction in 2030 and an absolute reduction in 2050. And those were not precisely defined. They were left to be between a lower bound, which is shown here with the purple line, representing a 50% absolute reduction in 2015, and an upper bound, 100% reduction in 2050. And that's why we've represented both of those potential future scenarios here, with the arrow pointing to the intended and stated ambition to reduce even faster if it becomes possible. The lower of those two lines is close to a proportionate response by shipping to the 1.5 degrees objectives. So if we take the Paris Agreement's framing of 1.5 and look at what would have to be done across the whole economy in order to achieve that temperature goal, stabilisation at no greater than that level of emissions, if shipping followed the orange line on this graph, it would do a very good job of contributing proportionately to that objective, i.e. without increasing its share of emissions. If it follows the purple line, then it will increase its share of emissions on that 1.5 degree pathway, and it could increase them against a well below 2 pathway as well, depending on exactly how that has been interpreted. So that's the overall statement of what IMO intends to do. What does this look like in practice? Well, for a lot of the shipping industry, it's important to think in terms of carbon intensity. That's the amount of CO2 emitted per unit of transport supply. And the reason for that is that this is a more meaningful way of thinking about how the technology in the fleet will have to change. Unfortunately for shipping, in some ways, there's an expectation of growth in world trade. And that growth in world trade, in combination with the radical reductions in CO2 emissions, which we saw in the previous slide, mean that carbon intensity has to change very fast for there to be any hope of meeting a 1.5 degree objective. And this graph gives a few example pathways of just how fast things would need to change. In principle, we've got the same representation. We've got time on the x-axis out to 2050, and the percentage improvement in carbon intensity on the y-axis, so how much better relative to a 2008 carbon intensity the fleet needs to be at a given point in time. And this is a global average, so the average ship in the world, or the average fleet in the world, needs to be on this pathway. Some will be above it, and some may be behind it. The different lines that you can see, except for the dark blue line, which represents a BAU scenario, the different lines that you can see, the red, green, purple and light blue, all represent 1.5 compatible trajectories in carbon intensity, showing improvements to about 100% carbon intensity at the latest by around 2040. And what that does is illustrate that there are different ways in which this objective can be achieved. If we are slow over the next 10 years in capturing carbon intensity improvements, like the turquoise line, then we have to undertake a very rapid carbon intensity reduction in 2030, almost overnight, in order to achieve a 1.5 pathway. If, on the other hand, we're much faster at implementing carbon intensity improvements over the next 10 years, that's before 2030, then we have the potential to have a more gradual transition into the latest part of the 2030s. That's the red line. And in essence, what we know from the engineering descriptions of ships is that for the majority of the savings, up to about 50% improvements, we can achieve those through the existing fuels technology using a combination of slow steaming, increases in ship size, and an increased attention to efficiency both in the design of the ships and in their operation. But to go much beyond that requires a transition to a use of a very different fuel mix, to use very low or zero carbon emissions fuels. And that's what is obviously apparent from about the early 2020s forwards, or in our extreme scenario, the turquoise line would need to be done overnight in 2030. The global fleet would have to switch from using fossil fuels to zero emission fuels in a very short period of time in that scenario. If we look at what's enshrined in the IMO's objectives, we can see those on this slide. They're the dotted lines, and they show that in 2030 the carbon intensity target is relatively low ambition, and in 2050 the absolute emission reduction target is clearly not sufficient for the 1.5 degree scenario. As I articulated, this means a rapid shift to wind assistance and zero emission fuels, so renewable energy for propulsion. This is a graph showing what the fuel mix might look like under just a 2 degree objective, and we can compare that with a 1.5 degree objective in this slide. Both slides are simulations produced using our models. They have time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis the energy share of different fuels, with dark blue being heavy fuel oil, light blue being diesel oil or distillate oils, turquoise being LNG, brown being hydrogen or synthetic fuels equivalent to hydrogen, and yellow being biofuels. And we have to undertake many assumptions. The key point in most of these is that a very rapid transition is required somewhere around the 2030s to a very significantly different fuel mix at the latest, and if possible earlier would make this a much easier transition. The price of renewable fuel is what drives the costs to the ship owner and the operator, and this is important when we're thinking about both policy measures but also impacts on the Pacific. And I've just got 2 examples that we've been using in many of our scenarios so far. If we just limit ourselves to thinking about hydrogen for a second, then if the electricity price is of the order of $60 per megawatt hour, which is low by today's standards, but not necessarily as cheap as some of the cheapest sources of renewable electricity are today. At those sorts of prices, the hydrogen price that you would have as a result of that level of electricity price is about $3,000 a tonne. And if we were to think of that as an equivalent to the current prices that are paid on ships to move goods around the world, that would be close to about $1,000 a tonne for fuel. That's whether it's heavy fuel oil or marine diesel oil. That would be our equivalent. So a significant increase over the $500 per tonne, maybe a slightly higher level, depending on exactly what fuel a ship is using today. If, however, the electricity price is significantly lower than that, for example, $30 per megawatt hour, which is half some of the prices considered there, but not incredible given the rate of improvements in production costs of solar cells and costs of onshore and offshore wind. Under those types of renewable electricity prices, the hydrogen price would obviously be approximately half, and the consequence of that would be an energy equivalent HFO or MDO price, which is much closer, if not the same as today's prices. So depending on the future of renewable electricity prices, the transport cost increases of these scenarios will vary, but could be very small increases or similar levels to our current fuel prices today. The way that we might achieve this outcome with policy measures can be outlined in this slide. We've grouped two sets of measures together. The first is a set of measures that need immediate adoption, which in IMO terms still means probably 1, 2, or 3 years of development. And there are at least two categories here. One set of measures which do not directly reduce carbon emissions but are important, and those are to do with removing market barriers and failures in the markets. And this can be done through transparency of performance of different operators and from strengthening the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, a tool which is used at the moment for energy efficiency management. But we think a more guaranteed reduction in carbon intensity would be brought about by something that is directly regulating operational carbon intensity. That would either need to be a carbon intensity standard applied to the existing fleet, or could indeed also be a speed limit, such as is applied to all ships of a given size and type. The way that this might evolve in the future is to have the policy measures that would then be needed to enable the fuel switches that we've described on the earlier slides. That would mean needing to have some sort of carbon price or a non-market carbon price levy, or number 5, which is a mandatory operational standard, which essentially determines that carbon intensity targets going to 0 carbon emissions per tonne mile are set and drive the uptake of zero emission fuels. So you could either use an economic instrument or a pure command and control instrument, or some combination of the two. One of the benefits of the economic instruments is that some of them will generate a fund, and that fund creates a source of money that could be reinvested into the sector, but could also be used to counteract negative impacts that occur on certain economies and help with the implementation of technology. So there are different advantages and disadvantages, and at the moment it's not clear exactly what outcome we will have in terms of policy measures, but there is plenty to be debated and considered. So what might this all mean in terms of impacts? Well, we know that if badly implemented, greenhouse gas mitigation action can increase transport costs. Those potential increased costs in fuels would essentially get passed through into increases in transport cost, which in turn can mean that you have to pay more for goods that you are importing, that services that currently exist reduce, potentially affecting transport security, and that a country's export competitiveness in global markets is reduced. Countries that have supply chains with very limited services and low competition are particularly vulnerable to these impacts, because the mechanism of competition enables cost reductions and marginal cost implementation to pass through as quickly as possible. So that's something that certain Pacific countries might want to pay particular attention to, even though we say that in general and across the global economy, impacts should be low and should be able to be managed. And what we mean by that is that if we do implement greenhouse gas mitigation well, the transport cost increase could be very small, and even a small transport cost increase might be small relative to the total trade cost, with many opportunities to offset and counteract increases in transport cost on the ship voyage with action undertaken elsewhere. And on that particular note, it should be noted that IMO has an obligation to safeguard small island developing states and least developed countries against adverse economic impacts, and that is clearly stated in the strategy. So there is a good reason to expect that that should be attended to. So what are the overall takeaways for the Pacific? Well, the first one is that the IMO greenhouse gas strategy, whilst not yet guaranteeing 1.5, is a major step forwards and due in no small part to Pacific voices. I didn't mention this at the time, but the emphasis placed by the Pacific on the urgency was crucial in the debating chamber to achieve the level of consensus on the targets that were achieved, even if we might still want them strengthened in the future. Globally, there is an urgent requirement to have some carbon intensity reduction beyond our current levels, and then we will need to follow that very swiftly with a switch to a renewable fuel if we are to get anywhere close to a 1.5 degrees pathway. There are probably two different groups of policy measures, those that will be implemented immediately and those that will need longer time to develop and will enable a more radical change in the fuel mix. Uncertainty remains exactly on the detail, and a sustained level of participation in that debate, especially stressing the urgency and the importance of decarbonisation, will be very important to ensure that that happens in practice. And finally, whilst there are impacts on Pacific small island developing states' economies that could be arising, these should be able to be avoided, but they will need sustained attention and support if we are to make sure that doesn't happen. Thank you very much. That is